Well, my journey, in a sense, I think is where I'd like to start, because I was born in this country, raised in this country, lived most of my life in this country. And Othello is one of the first people that you come across before Martin Luther King, before Marcus Garvey, before any of these, Malcolm X. You come across Othello. For better or for worse, you come across Othello. When you're 11 or 12 and your mind is open, Shakespeare is the first thing that's pushed onto you. It so happens that in my case, I kind of enjoyed it. But at that initial stage, when I initially read it, when I was about 12 or 13 years old, I rejected it. There are notions and ideas and concepts in it that initially, when you first read it, when you first think about it, they seem quite abhorrent, quite negative, quite stereotypical. That notion stayed in my mind for about a year, I think, 2 years, till I was about 14 or 15. I'm much older than I look, actually. Yeah. Till I was about 14 or 15. And then later on, when I was about 16, I revisited it. Now, I revisited Othello through Aaron. Aaron is a character in Titus Andronicus, who's also a Moor, and also written by Shakespeare. And when I was reading speeches of Aaron in Titus Andronicus, coal black is better than another hue, and it scorns to bear another hue. For all the water in the sea's wide ocean can never turn the swan's black legs to white. All that stuff. Where he says, when a white person, white character, blushes, he says, a fine treacherous hue, in reference to the whiteness, that will betray with blushing the deeper knacks and contours of their mind. Here is a lad famed of another Lear, yeah? And that kind of thing. So this character, Aaron, was a very powerful character written by Shakespeare. So I was reading these words written by Shakespeare. I thought, okay, so this character called Aaron is written by Shakespeare, and he says all these things. Of course, he dies at the end, but let me think and go back to Othello. So this making me revisit made me begin to reanalyze him. But I still wasn't quite happy. It took me another 3 or 4 years, and I began to read other plays, Renaissance plays, etc., etc. And then I turned about 18, 19. I was studying law at the time. So I thought, let me do some research. People can just keep repeating the same thing. Things of darkness. Black people as the other. Black people as strange. Black people as slaves. Oh, there weren't too many, They were all slaves, though, but there weren't too many. Kind of a contradiction. So I thought, okay. And everybody's writing the same thing. Historians write the same thing. English majors write the same thing. No disrespect. Actors and actresses say the same thing. So I'm thinking, it must be the truth. So I'm 19, 20, and I thought, okay, let me do some more research while I was studying the law. So my research started not with all these books. I did what you did. I put that to one side. And let me do some real original research. And it took me another 20-odd years of research. 20-odd years, right? Which I probably wouldn't have done if I'd known that was going to take that long. and the first thing that I did is I went to places where you wouldn't expect to find what you needed to find. So I went to parishes in rural areas, like Holt in Worcestershire. Yeah. Hatherley in Devon. Country places. And in those places, I found Africans, people of African descent, described as black or Moors, described sometimes as Negroes, not often, but occasionally, sometimes as Ethiopians, or sometimes just as black, often referenced by their African ancestry, coming late from Barbary, we're going to talk about the word Barbary perhaps later on, or coming from the Iberian Peninsula, or coming straight from West Africa. It isn't just a case of North Africa. Be clear. It isn't just a case of North Africa. In fact, there are more West Africans present in Tudor society than North Africans. That's what I found. And West African princes, too, also present in English society. So this research I put to one side of my thought process. And then when I revisited these Renaissance plays and stories, I had a different context. Some of the stuff also I began to explore, written by Englishmen at the time. George Best in 1579 says that he himself in England has seen a relationship between a white woman and a black man, with the child produced, his words, as black as the father is, expunging the white blood, the good white blood of the white mother. Meredith Hanmer in 1571 says something very, very similar. So there is that negative influence there, but there is also a positive influence too. And just as we try to evaluate what was in the 16th century English person's mind, we must begin to evaluate our own perspective. Because here in this society, we have a negative and a positive inscription. We would not like to feel, perhaps, that Nick Griffin, the British National Party, the UK Independence Party, Enoch Powell, and all these other politicians is the definitive definition of 20th and 21st century ideology. And then we try and reinterpret the plays and things that are produced here with entirely that perspective. Is there no other perspective? Just so that voice is loudest and noisiest? Does it mean that there is no other voice present in 20th, 21st century politics? Or 20th, 21st century lives? Most people in modern society have very little connection with political rhetoric and spend most of their existence existing with each other. And what I found in the English records was this, that the way in which white people in Tudor society, notice I say Tudor, I didn't say 18th century, I didn't say 19th, I said Tudor society, the way in which most people interacted was on a very local level, a very individual level, a very personal level, nothing sensationalist about it at all. This was a very important thing for me to discover. And it also made me revisit these plays because I'm not an apologist. I'm not an apologist for slavery, Martha, genocide, or any other thing, anti-Semitism. I'm not an apologist. If I see it, I see it. Right? But it made me revisit it because then what I began to understand is that English people in Tudor society did not understand what race was. That was the first thing that I understood. And nobody was saying it. They did not understand race. They had no concept of what we now understand it. Because they would say that the French are a race. The Germans are a race. The Spanish are definitely a race. And those Catholics, they're a separate race to us once we become Protestant. Of course, when we're Catholic, we're the same race. Right? Right? That's how they understand it. Right?
So the play is not racist.
I didn't say that. Yeah. They didn't understand race, but they did understand difference.
Okay.
And they did understand color, because they could see color. And they tried to make sense of difference and color and language. And most of the time, they couldn't make sense of it. So their ideas were all jumbled up. So they would look at, for example, with difference, they would say, and in terms of color, they would say, okay, you over there, right, and you here, your skin is black, right? It is black because of the sun. There was a school of thought from certain English people that this was true. Thomas More, famous Thomas More, Man for All Seasons, right? He talks about the blackness of Africans here and elsewhere. Yes, he does. Thomas More. And he concludes that this blackness is nothing more than the sun. And he concludes, wrongly, that a child born to a black man or black woman here in England will be born white, because lack of sun. And that a child born from a white person in Africa will be black because of the sun. Not only Thomas More think that, Francis Bacon in 1620 also says the same thing. Thomas Brown in 1646 says something very similar. Yes, and Robert Boyle in about 1660 also says something similar. So there's that school of thought. We may think that's rather quaint. But the point is, they don't have a concept that the blackness is something deeper inside. That the blackness is only skin deep. other people like George Best for nefarious reasons. Says that the blackness is the curse of Ham. He says that these people are born black, and the blackness runs deep inside, and as a result of the curse of Ham. But he's not sure. He says this because he's observing black children being born when the black father and the white mother are into a relationship, and the child is born black in England. And then looking at that, he tries to make sense of it and says, oh, in the theory of monogenesis, which is the idea that all of humanity originates from one family, the color of that original family must have had some color. He doesn't know whether that original family was black or white. He sees the child being born black in this country, and he therefore concludes, worryingly, if that's so, perhaps the original family was black. Oh, but that can't be true, he says, right? Because then that would mean that I am the other. And I don't want to be the other. So it must be that I am the original, and that the black is the other. But he's not sure. So what I'm just trying to highlight is that at this time, we are thinking that they have a concrete understanding of these things. I mean, we don't understand them now anyway, but we think that they have a concrete understanding. They do not have a concrete understanding.
So the play is not racist.
No. The ideas are movable and changeable. The concept of racism.
Okay.
Yes? This idea, racism is often talked about, often misspoke, I think, right? Because the actual definition of race is something which is relatively modern.
Right.
Francis Bernier in the 17th century, the end of the 17th century, long after these plays were written, began to try and figure out what were the nations of peoples. He defined this along color, and then related this color to the theory of the four humors. I don't want to get too academic in, yeah? So he said that there is a white race, which there isn't. He said there is a black race, which there isn't. He said there is a red race, which there isn't. And he said that there is a yellow race, which there isn't, right?
Well, there are no races.
Exactly.
There are no races.
Exactly.
It's a social construct.
That's right. But he says that these four colors are related to the theory of the four humors, phlegmatic, sanguine, etc. He doesn't necessarily attach a negative reference.
There is a positive reference to Othello's humors made by
yes,
Desdemona.
right.
Do you have that quote on the top of your head?
I think the son where he was born drew all such humours from him.
Yes, the jealous humors should have been drawn from Othello by the son of his
And that
birthplace.
there is a view that actually the African race was actually calmer, more collected than the European race.
And these are conflicting paradigms, and they're both, you can find each of them at work in Shakespeare's play.
But these ideas are later than Shakespeare. These ideas come about later in the 17th century. It isn't until the 18th century that you have ideas from Linnaeus, from John Frederick Blumenbach, which conjured up ideas of definite racial categories.
Right.
Now, what we do in the 20th and 21st century, which is entirely understandable, is that we then overlay our 21st century ideas of everything that's gone before. Fascism, Nazism, slavery, and all those different things, including the transatlantic slavery, and then we place it back on the 15th and 16th century where it shouldn't necessarily be. That doesn't mean that there isn't prejudice there, but it does mean that we don't have the racism that we think is there. But that doesn't mean we can't play it like that. We can play it with issues of race, because we're living in a society in which racism is playing a daily part in every one of our lives. But whether it's in Shakespeare's mind, I extremely doubt it.